I didn't in Oppos. T head out to the jagged edges of the Bitterroot Mountains looking for a fight. I went there for the kind of silence that stays with you long after the sun goes down. But as it turns out, silence is the one thing people in power can't stand, because on my very first week at that crooked little cabin, before I even knew the name of the valley, a midnight blue SUV with blacked-out windows rolled up to the edge of my timberline and just sat there, engine idling like a low growling animal, watching me through the dust. And that was the first time I felt that cold itch at the back of my neck, the kind that tells you the piece you just bought is about to cost a hell of a lot more than the closing price at the county auction. When I first stepped onto those 4 acres of overgrown pine and sun-scorched earth, my boots crunching over decades of fallen needles, it felt like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for 20 years straight in a windowless office in Chicago, where the air always smelled like stale coffee and the quiet desperation of men in cheap suits lying to each other. But out here, the air was sharp, it was honest, smelling of damp cedar and the cold, metallic breath of the lake drifting uphill. Through the shadows and the cabin itself. Well, most sane people would have called it a teardrop project, with half the porch sagging like a broken jaw and vines wrapping around the cedar siding, as if the forest was trying to pull the whole structure back into the dirt. But to me, it looked like redemption wearing a coat of dust, a place where I could disappear and finally remember who I was before the world started telling me who I had to be. I'd won the place at a tax lien auction, one of those in quote, as is in quote, listings nobody touches because it's too remote and too forgotten, tucked off a logging road that isn't even on most GPS maps. And I'd triple-check the title, the parcel maps, and the county surveyor's records myself, because after 2 decades of watching people twist the law into balloon animals, I wasn't in Oppos. T about to get caught in a loophole. I brought the basics, a generator I trusted more than most people I've worked with, a stack of rough-cut lumber, a camping cot, and enough canned chili to survive a small nuclear winter. And for the first few days, it was pure therapy, just me and a hammer, ripping off rotten shingles and sweeping out a decade of mountain dust while the owls watched from the rafters. And I'd forgotten how good it felt to hear absolutely nothing and actually trust it. But the world has a funny way of finding you just when you think you've escaped it. And on day 5, right as I was installing a small solar array on the south-facing roof, I heard the low, rhythmic crunch of gravel on the access road. Not my driveway, but the narrow fire path that ran parallel to my property line. And there was again that same dark SUV, no plates, just sitting there in the dappled sunlight, like a predator waiting for a mistake. I stood there on the ladder, hammer in hand, heart beginning to throb in my ears, wondering if I should wave or walk inside for my Remington. But before I could decide, the vehicle slowly reversed, disappearing into the thicket of Douglas firs without ever opening a door, leaving me standing in silence that suddenly felt heavy, staged, and completely wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just a curious neighbor or a lost hiker, but when you've spent years reading the body language of people who make a living out of being dangerous, your gut gets a lot louder than your logic, and my gut was screaming that I was being measured. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of bitter coffee and saw that my front gate, a heavy timber piece I just reinforced, was hanging off a single, twisted hinge as if someone had driven a bulldozer. Into it in the dead of night, and right in the center of my drive, hammered deep into the rocky soil, was a brand-new aluminum sign that read, Highland Estates Private Boundary, No Trespassing, HOA Managed Area. And I just stood there for a long minute, looking at the fresh splinters of my gate, realizing that the end quote, silence and quote, I'd moved here for was actually just the quiet before a very loud, very ugly storm. I didn't in Oppos. T called the police right away. Old habits die hard, and I wanted to see who was pulling the strings first. So I pulled out my phone and started recording the damage, noting the tire tracks that didn't in Oppos. T come from the main road, but from the old logging trail behind the property, which meant whoever did this knew the terrain better than a stranger should. And as I followed the tracks, I felt that strange sensation of being watched again, not by the trees, but by eyes behind glass. And then the end quote, welcoming committee in quote, arrived in person, 3 men in matching forest green polos with gold emblems on the chest, walking across my yard with the kind of practiced authority that people use when they don in Oppos. T actually have any, led by a man named Elias Thorne, a barrel-chested guy in his 50s with a jaw like a brick and eyes that looked like they hadn't into Oppos. He's seen a kind thought in 20 years. End quote. You and Oppos. Re on private community land. Friend, end quote. Thorne said, skipping the greeting and going straight for the throat, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like a threat wrapped in a suggestion, and I just leaned against my porch rail, dirty hands in my pockets, and told him that according to the Lincoln County assessor, I was on exactly 4 acres of my own dirt. He let out this dry, mocking chuckle and gestured to the 2 guys flanking him, one of whom was filming me on a tablet while the other shifted his weight just enough to show the holstered Glock on his hip. And he told me that, in quote, county politics, in quote, didn't in Oppos apply here, that Highland Estates had a superior charter, and that my cabin was an eyesore that violated about 15 different bylaws I'd never signed on to. End quote. I'm not in your HOA, Elias, end quote. I said, keeping my voice level because I knew exactly what he was trying to do, end quote. And I don an Oppos. T paid dues to men who break my gate in the middle of the night, end quote. And for a second, the air between us got real thin, real cold, as Thorne stepped into my personal space, smelling like expensive cigars and cheap power, and told me that cell service was real spotty in these mountains, and it'd be a real shame if I had an emergency and nobody could hear me calling for help. It wasn't an Oppos, a warning. It was a mission statement. And as they walked back to their Jeep, Thorne looked back over his shoulder with a smirk that told me they'd done this a dozen times before to people who didn't in Oppos. Have the stomach to fight back. But what he didn't in Oppos, know was that I'd spent my career dealing with much bigger sharks than a mountain town bully with a gold leaf badge on his shirt. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. They didn't in Oppos. Just wanted my land. They wanted my sanity. It started with the signal jamming, where suddenly my phone went from 3 bars to a dead gray, in quote. No service, in quote. Icon the second I stepped onto the porch, and then came the, in quote, ghost sounds, in quote, at night. A high-frequency hum that vibrated the tin in the cabin walls until my teeth ached, followed by a recording of a crying child played through hidden speakers. Somewhere in the woods, drifting in and out with the wind to make it impossible to pin down. I sat in the dark with my shotgun across my lap, watching the infrared feeds on the 2 backup cameras I'd hidden in the trees, the ones they hadn't in Oppos, found yet, and watched as Thorne's, in quote, security, in quote, team walked the perimeter of my cabin at 3 a.m., tapping on the siding with rhythmic knocks, 3 hits, then silence, then 3 more, try to bait me into coming outside so they could claim I was the aggressor. I called in an old favor, a guy named Miller who used to be a skip tracer for the feds and had a heart made of cold granite and a notebook full of things people wanted forgotten. And when he rolled up in his beat-up Chevy, he didn't in Oppos to even say hello. He just looked at the sabotage solar panels and the, end quote, private property, end quote, sign Thorne had hammered into my yard and muttered, end quote, you always did have a knack for picking the wrong neighbors, didn't in Oppos, you, end quote. Miller spent 2 days in town, digging through the dusty basements of the courthouse while I stayed behind the, end quote, fort, end quote. And when he came back, he had a manila folder that explained everything, including a developer blueprint for a, end quote, Highland Ridge Wellness and AMP, golf retreat, end quote. A $50 million project that was currently stalled because my 4 acres sat right where the main sewage line and the gated entrance were supposed to be. The HOA wasn't in Oppos, a neighborhood group. It was a shell company, a legal front for a land grab operation run by a woman named Victoria Vance, a local real estate mogul who'd been buying up, in quote, dead, in quote, parcel for pennies and using Thorne to harass the holdouts into selling. And my cabin was the final piece of the puzzle, the one thing standing between them and a massive payday. Miller and I sat on the porch, eating canned beans and watching the sunset, and he told me that Vance had a, in quote, consulting, in quote, contract with the county board, which is why the sheriff hadn't into Oppos. He returned my calls, and that the fake easement documents Thorne had tried to shove in my face were likely forged by a clerk who'd been paid off in Vance's, in quote, charitable, in quote, donations. In quote, they think you and Oppos, a tired old man looking for a nap, in quote. Miller said, cracking a rare, jagged smile, in quote. They don in Oppos. Realize you in Oppos. The guy who used to find the bodies the people like Vance try to hide, in quote. And that night, the pressure campaign turned into an assault because at 2:15 a.m., the cameras caught three figures moving with military precision through the brush, carrying jugs of gasoline and a pry bar, led by Thorne himself, who was no longer wearing his green polo, but a tactical vest and a mask that didn't oppose. T quite hide that arrogant sneer of his. I didn't oppose. T wait for them to reach the door. I stepped out onto the roof of the porch, silhouetted against the moon, and racked a 12-gauge shell into the chamber, the loudest sound in the world in the quiet forest. And I didn't oppose. T shout, I just whispered in quote. The sheriff ISN and oppose. T coming Elias, but the feds are already watching the live feed. And I'm really hoping you give me a reason to protect my life, end quote. Everything froze, the kind of stillness that feels like the world is about to crack open. And Thorne looked up, the gasoline jug dripping in his hand. And for the first time, I saw the flicker of real, jagged fear behind his eyes because he finally realized he wasn't in oppose. T dealing with a victim, he was dealing with a predator who'd been waiting for him to step into the light. Miller stepped out from the shadows of the shed with a high-lumen tactical light, blinding them. And we didn't oppose. T just have guns. We had the one thing Thorne couldn't oppose. T fight. Documentation, as Miller started reading out the private radio frequencies they'd been using and the bank wire transfer numbers from Victoria Vance's offshore account that he'd spent the last 48 hours tracing. The court case that followed wasn't oppose. T just a local scandal. It was a massacre because when we presented the infrared footage of Thorne trying to commit arson and the audio recordings of Victoria Vance telling her in quote, security in quote, team to in quote, burn the old man out if he doesn't in oppose. T take the check in quote, the in quote, Highland Estates in quote. Empire collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Thorne got 6 years for attempted arson and extortion, and Victoria Vance, the end quote, Queen of the Bitterroots, end quote, ended up in a federal orange jumpsuit for money laundering and racketeering, while the HOA was dissolved by a court order that returned every dime of, end quote, dues, end quote, they'd stolen from the real residents of the valley. I still live in that cabin, and the porch doesn't oppose. T sag anymore. The solar panels catch every bit of the mountain's sun, and the silence. Well, the silence is finally honest again, smelling of pine and cold water, and the knowledge that my land is exactly that. Mine, but sometimes when I see a dark SUV on the main road, I wonder how many other, in quote, wellness retreats, in quote, are built on top of the lives of people who just wanted to be left alone, and I wonder if the person sitting in that car knows that eventually everyone runs into someone who doesn't oppose. T know how to quit. Now, I gotta ask you, if you found out your dream home was sitting on a gold mine that some powerful group wanted to take from you, how far would you go to protect your peace? Would you take the check and run, or would you stay and burn the whole system down just to prove a point? Let me know in the comments, because I'm starting to think that in today's world, the only way to get some real quiet is to make a whole lot of noise first.